Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Academy of Urbanism Scotland's extended session on collaborative placemaking, focusing on post-engagement stage. This session forms a nice continuation of the Tuesday Coffee Break series, where we've heard from a variety of speakers on topics such as post-COVID places, shared spaces, tactical urbanism, new models of public transport, and projects like the Seven Lochs Wetland Park. If you've missed any of these and are interested, you can check these out on the Academy of Urbanism's YouTube channel. Today's session forms a continuation of what I think forms a broader theme of how we design and deliver more inclusive, people-centred places. This afternoon, we have a great lineup of speakers who've been involved in collaborative placemaking, including the Charrette programme, in a range of different ways. Before I go on to introduce our lineup, I'll introduce myself. I'm Heather Claridge, a Principal Design Officer and Academician of the Academy of Urbanism. I'm currently on secondment to Architecture and Design Scotland from Glasgow City Council, and I'm thrilled to be chair for this discussion today. I myself have been involved in charrettes in different ways, different stages, and quite often it's been at that post-engagement stage where others have been involved, and it's kind of over to me to help get things kind of kick-started. And I suppose I'd be first to admit that some have went really well and some have not gone as well as anticipated. Quite often things haven't kick-started as much as had been kind of planned, and actually the impact on the partnership has been quite kind of damaging. And I've probably found myself, more than once kind of thinking, with only a bit of hindsight, things could have been slightly different. And I think that works across the board. Even if things went well, we all think, could we have done things slightly differently? And I think I'm probably not alone in feeling like that. And I guess when we look at this context in Scotland, when we're starting to think about local place plans being introduced by the new Planning Act, and actually the situation we find ourselves in at the moment, needing still to create more inclusive and people-centred places, the timing feels really apt to be talking about this. So how do we collectively create the right conditions to follow through, turning plans into action and talk into impact? So I think that kind of sets us off for what will be a great discussion. And this afternoon, offering some foresight to address my hindsight dilemma, we have great speakers. So first up, we have Dr. Murray AoU, academician and lead researcher from University of Dundee in sustainable urban design. So I hear that some of his things he's sharing today are hot off the press, so that should be good. So providing a bit of context on why the post-engagement stage matters and using evidence in terms of impact. Next up, we have Kevin Murray, academician and director of Kevin Murray Associates, sharing learning from his involvement in planning and delivering charrettes and the action plans that come from them. Then we have Twaddell from Prestwick Community, sharing on the process and impact of the Talk Prestwick Town Centre charrette. And last but not least, we're ending on a double act from Hilary Smith from North Berwick Coastal Area Partnership and Sandra King from East Lothian Council, who's also been involved in helping the North Berwick Coastal Area Partnership on sharing some of their learning around North Berwick Town Centre charrette.
Thanks very much for the Academy for inviting me. Thanks for the audience. And also, I am aware we have a lot of people from England and even from the Middle East. So welcome everyone. What I am going to present today, it's an ongoing research project started and kindly funded in 2017 by the Scottish Government with all the above partners, as you can see. What you're going to see today is really, I call it action research. So it is not my voice. Whatever I will propose is the voices of really those who engage with the project from Scotland and beyond. And we are very grateful for those really involved with this project. So it's really bring practice, theory, and reflections. And this is some of the publications. I would be more than happy to share it with with my colleague in the Academy, and share it with everyone for those who are really interested in this kind of projects, because I am delighted to say this is the first project ever worldwide evaluating the post-charrette programs. And I'm delighted to be Scotland to take lead on this project. And I'm not claiming we solve everything, but I'm going to share some of the challenges, limitations, but also opportunities. First of all, let us put it this way. Design-led events or Charrette is only as good as what happens after. What matters is really what happened after. There is still perceptions in Scotland and beyond. Charrette is only about design events, but what matters is what happened after. Once an event is completed, the process is far from over, and it is seen as critical that the momentum is kept through its completion. So the completion, what delivery is what matters at the end of the day, especially for local communities. Tangible delivery and real follow-up change or actions are really key. There is a danger that the event that are successful on the day, on the event itself, may risk a negative effect if non-delivery leads to disillusion and even growing distrust. And this happened in many case study and examples. So the hangover and what happened next is key. So over-promising, especially in the design event itself, and under-delivering is really very dangerous. The event itself is not a delivery vehicle. That's another thing. But what is important to employ a delivery vehicles and action program and mechanism for it. So that's quite important. So the event itself should end all the time with a clear action plan, which specify clearly the delivery vehicle and where the funding come from and the priorities, which one should come first, which one second, which one third, and who might be responsible. So what next is really so crucial in terms of defining responsibility, fundings, but also skills. One thing to bear in mind, format and output from any design-led events will vary. So there will be no one design, one fit approach for it. So that's quite crucial. And it shouldn't be viewed as a standalone exercise. Rather, they need to be seen as part of ongoing conversations with the community and the relevant stakeholders. Why? To help to show progress, to explain and implement decision-making, but also to demonstrate to the stakeholders that they are really making differences. The problem in Scotland, design-led event, they do not have any statutory status in Scotland planning system. Without this, action plans arising from them risk non-completion, especially where large-scale activities are envisaged, effected through partnerships, agencies, or stakeholders group that they don't themselves have a legal standing. That's really crucial. No wonder why some local authorities in some area adopted the final report in the Charrette as a part of the supplementary document in their statutory planning, and that's work. Also, I have to say, over the last 10 years, planning policy may mandate more technocratic approach to participation, but this is unlikely to be effected unless adequate governance structure are put in place. That's require decision-making makers not only to listen to local voices, but also to act on them. So Charrette is not only about listening to people, but also to act on them. What comes before the Charrette, during the Charrette, but more importantly after that is really critical. And the success of the Charrette is not only about post. The pre-Charrette and the during event is really so key to inform the delivery of the Charrette itself. So the big challenge for us, how to address the hangover effects where community members are left confused as to how their participation follow through into the next stage of planning. Again, back to what I said, tangible delivery and real follow is really key, especially to keep the momentum, to keep the trust and the follow. Over the last 3 years, we managed to map the stages. We're not proposing here a linear system, no at all. But what we found, this is what we found in research, in action research. There are 3 stages before the actual event, and I don't want to go through the nitty-gritty about them. the design event. But what we found importantly in the post-Charrette, there are two stages: the post-event engagement and the aftercare. And I will later on say something about them. The problem: who is responsible? Who are they, these stakeholders? And because there is always a challenge in the post-Charrette, who is taking that responsibility? Is it local communities? Is it the commissioner, the initiator? Who is going to do it? Who is going to deliver it? Who is going as well to analyze to how can I say, to review the progress? So there is a lot of questions. We managed to map, there are three in parallel, how can I say, memberships and stakeholders. Those could be the stakeholders management team, facilitators teams, but also the designers. Interestingly, facilitators and designers, their role in reality, they finish after the Charrette, especially once they submitted, once they presented the final report. This is how it works because their task is limited, if I may say. What is important? The stakeholders management role, right from the beginning to the end. And if we are really serious about who is going to deliver those, delivery should start right from the beginning of the process in pre-Charrette. So that's one of the key findings we found, that delivery has to be understood right from the beginning. This slide is so important. Yes, design event is a big thing, but the handover and the transitions stage after the design event is really so key, especially once it's to submit and present the report in front of the community in terms of understanding the action plan, delivery groups, and who are they, those delivery groups, and the relationship between the communities, local communities, their responsibility, and local authorities. Now, there is no right and wrong answer we found out when it's come to who is responsible for the delivery. There should be a balanced approach, a partnership approach between the two itself. Why? Because local authorities with the cut, they might be not able to deliver everything. On the other hand, community groups, especially once they start establishing what they call it community trust, and that's, by the way, may take time, they might be able to apply for fund. And so time issue is really so critical in here. And this is all about building, not only building trust, building capacity. But this may take time. But what is important, the first 3 to 6 months after the design-led event is really very key in terms of, because there is a lot of confusion after that in terms of handing the responsibility. Who owns this? Wow, this is our new original contribution to the knowledge. This slide is only 1 week old. We haven't made it open to public yet. This came from a recent research in Scotland, unpacking in greater depth what's happened in post-Charrette. We found out after the design-led events, we must have a stage called delegating stage, in which you transfer ownership, but also you detail and explain who is responsible. You move from design interventions to more planning and policy interventions. That's one. There is one called post-event engagements. Here, this is about follow-on activities in which you start explaining what might happen on the ground, where things may have to work, where things hasn't worked. But what is important in this stage, we notice in Scotland, the quick win delivery. There must be kind of quick win delivery in order to keep the trust, building momentum with the local community. Aftercare as well, this come later on in order to understand the performance of what has been delivered, whether they met the requirement, they met the expectation or not, whether we should apply for further fund and who is responsible. And the last one, what we call it, the schedule review, re-evaluation. This is about monitoring progress, checking post-event activities, whether they remain on track within the allocated budget, or even evaluating outcomes. Before I finish, those as well, we found them interesting from both local community groups and local authority and facilitators. Ownership in the transitional stage. It has to be a balanced approach, a balanced partnership with different parties between local authorities and community groups. the importance of handing on responsibility, but identifying who is it responsible. There should be kind of mechanism to support that transitions. There should be ownership from the community local groups, but also we notice in any successful case study, we notice there should be a community champions. They are skillful in terms of communication, coordinations, and they have kind of really good project management. So that's, we found it really interesting when it's come to the type of skills, because the skills you will require to facilitate a design-led event so different from the post-Charrette. That's another challenge for delivery. The skills set itself is really very different between Charrette and post-Charrette. Engagement and understanding delivery and what should be delivered should start from day one, which is the pre-Charrette, in terms of building capacity, understanding who is responsible, who is the funder, and this is all about keeping the momentum. The use of the research report is really so key. There are many research reports. They may have a lot of aspiration, but they lack clarity on terms of action program, shared plan, and even delivery vehicle. And then funding delivery. The establishment of constitute body is really very key, we found it, but that may take some time, and this may require a new way of fundings. Factor seen as a contributing success, I would like to say, early involvement of all stakeholders is key. Yes, collaboration is still very key, even post-Charrette. Capacity building has to be carried on. There should be clear delivery vehicle. Having a plan, clear plan in place between different parties, and skills needs kind of skills, as I said, in terms of digital skills, engagements and communication, thinking about delivery from the start. And I would like to finish with just a couple of points from the conclusion. Building capacity is really key, not at least for upscaling local stakeholders. That's quite really very key. And this should start from the before event, during the event, and after the event. What else I want to say? The local plan, inter-Scotland planning area. The design-led event must be used to encourage input from local stakeholders groups, moving their involvement in the decision making. I am afraid this is still a little bit gray area, and there is a huge concerns about what happened to the Charrette program as part of the local place plans.
Husam, I think that's a really good point to end on, because there's lots of questions coming through the chat about that. How do we think forward? So I think what we'll do is we'll move on to the next speakers and pick up that train of thought that you were ending on in the discussion, because I think there's lots of common themes coming through. I thought that was great. I mean, I thought there's some interesting points for me coming through that. Obviously, there was kind of common words about responsibility, ownership, building capacity, which you ended on, but that idea of you putting forward statutory, is there a statutory function? And I think that's where we get into the next stages of thinking about what is the relationship to local place plans for it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in Kevin now to give a bit of his experience, obviously being involved with lots of charrettes in terms of the delivery, the planning of them, and then the action plans that you said were so critical into that. Kevin, do you want to come in now?
My role is really as a facilitator supporting the process and getting to the end of the charrette process and helping take it forward thereafter. So I am conscious that lots of other people in the metaphorical room have similar experiences, both facilitating, but also designing and also taking them forward within the community and within local authorities. When we get to the chat, we'll open out and include that. But I'm really just talking from my perspective at the moment. And the first few slides shall explain that. So if you click the next one, I'm really concentrating on that area. So it's literally from the end of the charrette. The assumption is you've had some community facing placemaking events, one or more. There is a handover that's quite key, as Husam has identified. And the idea is that it takes place within 1 to 6, ideally 1 to 3 or 4 months after the main events and activities, helping take whether it might be policy or design or other work forward afterwards, and that might include bidding for things. The whole premise, of course, is that it's a collaborative process. It's focused around increasingly co-production. In the old days, 10, 20, 30 years ago, the consultants or the local authority would have led the design process, but it's much more collaborative now. But that depends on building trust and credibility within the process. And if it goes well, building up a sense of empowerment around the product and the direction and the way forward. It's important to appreciate that the people who do this, and there are many of them are on this call, we all come from different backgrounds, some from architecture and planning, some from housing associations and tenant participation. And there are also people in this sphere from market research, from health, even from counselling and mediation. And I discovered in preparing this, of course, that not only had I worked with other people who've done it, like Andrews Duaney and John Thompson and Drew Mackey and people like that, I'd actually been trained in youth work myself before I became a planner. So we bring all that baggage together. So, and I don't mean baggage in a negative sense, it's that shared experience. So in our organisation, KMA, that implies a mix of geography, of sociology, of social science, but also, very importantly, working with different communities around the dynamics of place as a physical place, but also as a social space too. And whoever you work with in this world will have a litany of places. So just like the community have lived and worked in different places and have their stories, so do the consultants who've worked often together in different projects all around the country or around the world. But they'll also have stories about their mistakes. So the one in the bottom right was, it was going to be creative and fun to dress up as phone boxes in Kirkintilloch where they're made. But when I went into a cafe to enlist people to come to the event, one of the children burst into tears, thought I was some kind of alien, and that meant 2 families weren't coming to the event. So we can often get that sort of thing wrong too. There are 3 critical ingredients for the post-Charrette. 1 is that you've got a shared plan, 2, that you've got an action program going forward, and 3, that there's a delivery vehicle or mechanism, what we sometimes euphemistically call the bread van. So the first is there's an output from a Charrette process, and this is a lot of work done by colleagues on the Clydebank one. I'm not sure if Colin Ross is on the call or not, but that kind of creative output, it captures conversations and stories and ideas for the future. But as you work through the process, you've got to build in direction, sometimes using things like scenarios and tools like that, to build a plan that hangs together. And in some of these instances, and there are some really other good examples from the likes of St Albans, where there's a 3D model or a design brief that emerges. The key is to see that what's coming out as a platform for going forward. So there's a vision and direction, but it's also beginning to build a plan and priorities. But some of the key tests, and I think this relates to some of what Heather was asking at the last one, between the 2 talks. Is there a consensus? Is this a genuine building up of a shared perspective from all the participants? Has it got positive momentum and support behind it? But critically, what are the links with policy and the agencies and players who may be involved in delivering it, whether businesses or landowners or statutory bodies? Some of the ones that have been done in the last few years, in Scotland, the programme has been running for a decade, but some of this has been done for longer. Some of them could be taken now without having to start a fresh process and actually help work with the post-COVID recovery situation. So here's an example from some of the work done in the town centre Charrette in North Berwick. And that one was with Willie Miller and John Dale's inputting to that. Here's another one which Willie Miller illustrated from the Charrette in Tranent, which Sandra will know well. And it was often about reallocating road space and making safe routes. All of these would be hugely beneficial, not only to shops and traders, but to the schools and so on nearby. And the same thing applies on many of the inner city neighbourhoods, like this example from Springburn in North Glasgow, where the rethinking of the road space has already been pre-planned, and some of this could be taken forward without having to restart a process. So lots of the ideas the community have already contributed to are there. As Husam's identified, it's then about the action programme going forward. This example, the one in the middle and the right, is from Prestwick, which you're going to hear about shortly, but they took something like 130 ideas, distilled them down to about 30, and then processed it into both a spatial plan, but also a program plan. And that was done with John Lord and Willie Miller and Ice Cream Architecture. So here's another one where you get to the point where it's not just the process of the charrette, it's how are you going to take it forward together. The charrette has brought together those players shown in the diagram on the left, and they've worked in the town, in the neighbourhood. This one is from Kincardine. It's really about a dynamic of building capacity. So you have the handover event as shown in the top right, and there might be a report or a plan, and it might even have more status like a charter or a design code, and hopefully the next cycle in Scotland will be in the form of local place plans. The key is around building a partnership with momentum, with the key players in terms of authorities, but quite possibly other community organisations such as trusts, and there's some listed there, or business organisations like business improvement districts, but also keeping the key local politicians, council, community council, MPs and so on board. And the next slide shows the example of the recent grouping from Springburn, who are now coming together as a development trust. So the legal vehicle in taking forward the project becomes quite important. So there's it. It's very simple, 1, 2, 3, and it's working together to take things forward in terms of costing and delivery. But my final slide coming up reminds us that it isn't all that simple. There are things that can go wrong. We will have raised aspirations and expectations and even excitement about a place, but if we don't hand over and take it forward together, if we don't get the commitment from the key agencies and the key individuals in those agencies, we might not get traction with the relevant bodies, and it will be seen as talk but no action, and that will tend to take the community and the relationships with the authorities backwards. So we'll get cynicism and distrust. So that's the risk. So to finish, the headlines are, we need a well-organized charrette with a consensus coming together on the direction forward, engaging the partnerships on a delivery mechanism to go forward, thinking in work streams in terms of delivery, with early actions as Husam identified to build confidence, collaborating on the longer term projects which are harder, but finally supporting each other. And that's the key. Thanks very much. I hope it's not going to be a contradictory story from that, which you're going to hear from the other representatives in a few minutes.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kevin. That was great. And yeah, I'm interested to hear if the examples of North Berwick and Prestwick, if they had all the ingredients. And I think there's some comments which we'll pick up on when we get to the discussion, which are saying, what happens if there's an element missing, or is there a prioritization of those 3 things there for it? I like the phrase that you had about building in direction, because I think that's ultimately it. We're trying to build in direction to then make impacts on the ground. So that lots of things to kind of pick up on the discussion. We're going to go on to talk to Julie. She's going to share the experience which happened in Prestwick, and I'd be interested if she kind of picks up on, yeah, where are all the ingredients, where might be the things that maybe didn't quite go to plan for that. So Julie, if you are there.
So I'm just starting with one slide that just is a sort of summary of our project. And I'm actually thinking I should be changing my title to Community Champion. Hello. That was very much my role. It was great listening to Husam and Kevin, because when people talk about building capacity in communities, I'm the sort of person that they're talking about. I moved back to Prestwick to become an unpaid carer for my mum who had dementia. My background though was in business development. My sister and I both lived in Prestwick, and we had an issue with sort of one bit of planning in Prestwick, and a good Scottish word, gallus. We were quite gallus about it. This isn't my world, so gallus, if you don't know the Scottish word, means you're bold, you're confident, and maybe a little bit cheeky, but maybe, you know, with a good heart. So we just started to investigate this one issue we had with this one project in Prestwick, and we knocked on lots of doors at the council, tried to talk to lots of people, and we met this one really supportive chap, Gus Collins, and he suggested that we don't just look at this one issue, but we go town-wide. Like I say, this isn't my world, but I knew a chap in Glasgow that was fundraising for a charrette in his area. So when the council mentioned, we can maybe do a charrette, I just jumped all over it. My sister had no idea what I was agreeing to, but we agreed to be one of the stakeholders in the steering group. You're absolutely right. It all starts with who's in the steering group, who starts the process. I think the council were quite surprised that we wanted to be so involved, but we made sure that we got in there and stuck our elbows out, and we stayed. We had members from Community Council, Health and Social Care Partnership, and other community groups. We had Sustrans, transport people. We also worked hard to make sure that voices that weren't usually heard in these kinds of groups, ourselves really, and others, were represented. The steering group was key in the tender process. So Prestwick's in South Ayrshire. South Ayrshire had already had 2 charrettes, and I don't know the ins and outs, but I do know that at the time it was felt not many outcomes had been delivered, hadn't particularly engaged with the community. So that didn't put us off. And what we were sort of encouraging was, well, let's get some different people involved. Let's get a different consortium involved. So we were involved in the tender process, and we helped choose the group to lead our charrette. Kevin was indeed one of the facilitators, and I think we did a really good job, I must admit. They did a very good job. I should maybe explain the image that's up there. Over the 4 days of workshops that we had, we engaged with the community really effectively. In fact, we were recognised by the Scottish Government as a really effective bit of community engagement. We had an artist who listened to what was happening in the workshops, and she drew the narrative of Top Prestwick. And funnily enough, I just picked up on one of the phrases somebody used of a local councillor had said his fear was we weren't managing people's expectations. And you know, I think that we did, but we didn't seek to then dampen that enthusiasm. So over the 4 days, the sorts of areas that were discussed, we discussed the main street, obviously that's our main retail thoroughfare, the seafront, parking and access, arts and culture, health and social care, enterprise and employment, marketing and communications, and heritage. The feedback that Kevin and the consortium gave us at the end was we were one of the first times that they worked with that didn't just ask for big infrastructure developments. We were a town that sort of cared for our people, and we wanted to embrace social change and sustainability. I've added images of just the 3 main projects that were highlighted by people in the town. One of the first projects to get a boost was Dementia Friendly Prestwick. It was a new group of people. It has subsequently become a registered charity, a SKIO. You're talking about early wins. Absolutely, early wins we knew was important to keep the momentum going, because there is a lot of cynicism, you know. Before I became a champion, you know, I was a regular resident, and you know, there is if you're not involved in the process, it's easy to lose heart. So Dementia Friendly Prestwick quickly built a community garden in our local rehabilitation hospital that was open for anyone to visit, and that was embraced. The Friends of the Broadway Prestwick was a group that had been in existence, had applied to the lottery for a feasibility study, and had been knocked back for legitimate grounds. This Top Prestwick Charrette report was like a pre-feasibility study. Again, the capacity was raised of the local residents that were part of that group. I became a director, I joined. We applied to the Scottish Government for Sustaining Communities Fund. We were successful this time, and we have raised lots of money, lots of money to help this project. And that was one of the most popular projects in the town. It was a derelict building, and I think people had kind of given up a bit of hope. But we were able to work on that. And we also saved Prestwick Beach. It sounds like a boast, but it really isn't. We had rubble had been washing up on Prestwick Beach. And I think it was felt that the solution was going to be quite expensive. So the council, I think it's fair to say, was loath to get involved because it felt like it would be expensive. But the Charrette put a focus on it, and the public spoke, and it was very important. And it turns out with a little bit of effort, it wasn't that expensive to get a solution. It's a process to remove the rubble from the beach. And 2 years after our Charrette, we won a Keep Scotland Beautiful Clean Beach Award, which is fantastic. So in terms of the process, we knew that the Charrette report wasn't going to come neatly packaged up with a lot of funding. There was a lot of conversation about which is the one group that's going to lead this. And I felt really strongly that it needed several groups. It needed several groups with a passion. So I resisted having, not that it was my choice, but that was just where I wanted to put my efforts was in what was important to me, which was dementia-friendly Prestwick, saving the beach and the Broadway. The phrase, we're worried that the report is going to sit on someone's shelf and get dusty. Having the quick wins meant you could just point to it and say, well, it's not sitting on my shelf. We also, in terms of a heritage project, we got a small bit of funding, and the community created a audio walking tour, which has been very popular locally in town. With failures, the only one thing to highlight is possibly because it was so democratic. When we put the report together, when the consortium put the report together, everybody's passion project kind of made it into the report, but that was just a very minor point that possibly validated some ideas that were a bit more bonkers than others. But generally, we had a really positive experience, and we have gone on to develop some, projects that have got legs. And that is the roundup from the Prestwick Community Champion, which I guess I'll have to get business cards made. Thank you.
Julie, that was great. And I think a few things that came through for me, obviously emphasising what we'd heard before about that ingredient. I think the idea of quick wins that you'd said, but something about actually communicating those quick wins, because I think quite often, sometimes if things have moved on, people forget that actually that they were wins that were identified in the Charrette. So linking it back to that document that sits on a shelf somewhere, but saying this is linked all together. I think that came, and having actually the you as a champion to be able to make those connections. I think packaging it up into different actions, and there's some discussion about how things are linked to bigger strategic funding, which I think we'll pick up on, but the idea of chunking it down and having several groups seemed to come through for me very strongly. I'm very interested to kind of hear on the other side of the country in North Berwick, if there are some similar things, what were their challenges, what were the successes. So I'm going to bring in Hilary and Sandra. Now we've got 10 minutes left. We can have a wee bit more, but I'm conscious that there's lots of really good questions and we want to get to the discussion. I'm sure you're all dying to even talk to each other of what you've heard. So bring in Sandra and Hilary.
Hi, I'm Sandra King. I'm one of the Connected Communities Managers working East Lothian Council, and I support the area partnership in the North Berwick coastal area, which is one of 6 local community area partnerships. And this is a way for local people to really have a say in what's important to them in terms of the service planning and delivery in the area. And really it's about communities having a say in what matters to them. And the area partnerships made up of your East Lothian councillors, community councillors, tenants and residents association, the pupil and parent council reps, And then there's other umbrella groups in the North Berwick area. That's like North Berwick Community Centre, a mental health charity. There's quite a number of them. There's probably about 25 to 30 members that come along to the meetings. Probably what's a bit more unique in East Lothian is that each area partnership has a budget, and they have 50,000 of a general budget which they can spend on any projects that they feel are important to that community. They also can spend 50,000 from the roads budget. And in the case of the North Berwick Coastal Charrette, we have subgroups that meet, and one of the subgroups, the On the Move subgroup, which Hilary chairs, has an active travel agenda, and also was looking at North Berwick High Street and trying to make it more accessible for everybody. Our overarching theme for all the area partnerships is to reduce inequalities, and this was key to the whole Charrette project. So we really were impressed with the Kevin Murray Associates, who really had to work hard at reaching all those that you know, wouldn't come forward to local community meetings normally. As I say, it was overall was to reduce inequalities, and we as a area partnership put together an area plan, and within that plan, which is now a 5-year plan, the North Berwick High Street Charrette is embedded in that plan. It's also embedded in the town centre plan, and it influences all the other departments in the council's planning. That's the theory. And it's important to note that the North Berwick Coastal Area Partnership put the application into the Scottish Government, and we brought together quite a key steering group, including people from the council in terms of planners, our town centre regeneration manager, our roads people, and our community development people in the area partnership. So I'll hand over to Hilary to say a wee bit more about the Charrette itself.
Okay, thanks, Sandra. Yeah, the steering group commissioned the Charrette in 2017, which I think we saw earlier. I saw a slide from that earlier. And well, 2017, we got the report, the recommendations. It was all incredibly well received. The community were very enthusiastic, very motivated for things to happen, for change to happen, which, as we've touched on, I think, in previous speakers, that brings with it a whole lot of baggage and a whole lot of expectations. But so it took us almost a year, in fact, over a year. It was December 2018 before we first managed to meet to form an implementation group to put forward these recommendations. Nobody's fault that it took that amount of time, changes in personnel, just getting people together, but it was a significant amount of time. So one of the things we wanted to do right from the beginning was a quick win to show that we were still there, still pushing to get the Charrette recommendations put forward. So there's a couple of junctions that we managed to do, but also we wanted to concentrate as a priority on the east end of the High Street. So our implementation group, which was drawn from volunteers from our On the Move group and our area partnership, worked with transportation to draw up some suggested plans, some suggestions as how we could make the East End safer, you know, more accessible for everybody. And we held a 3-day event in the High Street to sort of publicise these. We were absolutely mobbed by people.
In the police station.
Like 600 people come through the door over the 3 days, which for a small town is quite excessive into a very small space. And I would say that the vast majority of them were very supportive of what we were trying to do. Some were saying we weren't going far enough, but there was a significant number of people who, and very vociferous, who were very against what we were doing. They felt very threatened by it. I think there was a little bit of misinformation perhaps in there, but they did feel very threatened. So this was a very difficult 3 days that we had as this event, and it was quite a challenge, I think, to get through that. However, it was a bit of a crucial point in the game, a bit of a turning point, because following that and following the discussions that came on the back of some of these negative comments, we looked at our implementation group and we expanded it massively. So instead of just being the bunch of volunteers that were there to try and help push this forward, we now had buying into it members of our community council, our elected members who had not, to be fair, been very active in this before. We had members of the business community who had been given lots of opportunities to get involved and had been involved, but now we're really at the centre of it, and that was really good. So on the back of this rather painful process, we had a much bigger, much more effective working group. A working group normally is of a small size, and we now had something like about 15, 20 people, I think, sitting around a table at one point, which is a little unwieldy, but it still worked. So working together, these people were all coming from very different perspectives. We managed, with a bit of cajoling and keeping everybody together and keeping everyone focused, to draw up more plans for the high street, and not radically different, funnily enough, to the ones we'd already suggested, but they were much more acceptable to everybody. And we were just about to press the go button on this, so that we had a trial of our new revamped high street at Easter, and COVID happened. So the plans have been put on the shelf. East Lothian Council now are looking at a more radical approach to our high street, because our high street is very narrow. It's an old medieval high street, very narrow, incredibly narrow pavements. It is impossible to socially distance in that kind of scenario. So I think that they are hoping to put in place something that is even more radical than what we were suggesting. So that's a really interesting kind of outcome. I'm quite curious to see how that plays out, and how at the end of it, whether or not the community will buy into this more radical approach, or whether we'll scale back to what we were suggesting, or indeed scale right back to what we have at the moment. I doubt it, but it remains to be seen. So when you asked if we would take part in this, you asked if we would maybe share some learning points, and I've got 3 that I'm quite happy to say. The first one is about that expectation management. I think we've all talked about that actually at the end of our report, when we got the report, there was this huge upswelling of community motivation, and then nothing happened for such a long period of time. That was really difficult then to kind of pick up from that and to get going again. And I think that is key. I think people didn't know how to take the report and make it into an actuality. And so what Husam was talking about earlier on about having this transition phase, I think is really interesting. The second part is obviously get the right people around the table. You need to have the right people in the room. And I think we tried to do that, but the way in which we got the people in the room was when people felt threatened or felt uncomfortable with what was happening, and felt then that there was a political will to get involved. There was there was a self-interest, I suppose, to some extent, and there was also a kind of much more altruistic thing with the volunteers. So there had to be a challenge in order for people then to come back into that room. So that in itself is quite an interesting point. And the last thing I'd really like to say is that I think Kevin's mentioned this, is that you have to nurture that true spirit of collaboration. You have to have a shared goal, and you have to be working towards that goal and be really clear about what that goal is. Because I found, I found that over the last couple of years I've been involved with this, that people have taken the report that we had and have interpreted the recommendations to suit themselves to a certain extent. They have used the report as a mandate to push forward their ideas, even though they may be diametrically opposed to somebody else who's doing exactly the same thing. And so there needs to be a teaming out right at the beginning of what these goals are, and so that you can then work properly collaboratively. Because just putting people in a room together and hoping that you're all going to agree on, it was quite difficult. I think that's really all I need to say on that. But that's a potted history of the North Berwick Town Centre Charrette and where we are now.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sandra and Hilary. I think that was great. And also, it's always difficult to share things that maybe didn't go quite as kind of planned. And that was the idea of this event, was to think about kind of hindsight and forward sight. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually try and pick a few questions to give to the speakers. And then I'll maybe invite a couple of people. There's lots of chat, and I think it really reflects what you were saying about the idea of kind of raising expectations. That's needed. The idea of kind of balancing, kind of measuring what happens next.